In Bob Ross's final painting, completed just weeks before his death in 1995, he included symbols that no one understood at the time. A lone tree without leaves, a sunset that looked more like an ending than a beginning, and hidden in the corner, a small detail that made his closest friends realize Bob knew exactly what was coming. What did Bob Ross paint that revealed he was saying goodbye? It was March 15th, 1995, and Bob Ross was in his private studio at his home in New Smyrna Beach, Florida. The lymphoma that had been quietly ravaging his body for months was now impossible to ignore. Though Bob had told very few people about his diagnosis, he had always been a private man when it came to personal struggles, preferring to keep his pain hidden behind that gentle smile that had comforted millions. But on this particular evening, as the Florida sun began to set over the coast, Bob picked up his brushes one final time with a purpose that was different from anything he had painted before. He wasn't creating for television, wasn't teaching a technique, wasn't even painting for the joy that had driven him for decades. Tonight, Bob Ross was painting his farewell. The canvas he chose was smaller than his usual television paintings, just 11 by 14 inches. He had always said that size didn't matter in art, that a small canvas could hold just as much beauty and meaning as a large one. Tonight, he would prove that philosophy in the most profound way possible. Bob began with the sky, but instead of his usual bright blues and whites, he chose colors that spoke of endings, deep purples that faded to burnt orange, with touches of gold that suggested the last light of day. His brushstrokes were slower than usual, more deliberate. Each color was placed with the precision of someone who knew this might be his last chance to say what was in his heart. Every painting tells a story, Bob had said countless times on his television show. Tonight, his painting would tell the most important story of his life, the story of how a gentle man prepared to say goodbye to the world he loved. As Bob worked on the sky, he thought about all the sunsets he had painted over the years. Thousands of them, each one representing hope, peace, the promise of a new day coming. But this sunset was different. This sunset was about completion, about the natural cycle that governs all living things, about the beauty that can be found, even in endings. The mountains came next, painted in soft purples and grays that seemed to fade into the distance like memories. Bob had always loved painting mountains. They represented strength, permanence, the eternal beauty of nature. But these mountains seemed softer somehow, less imposing, as if they were gently receding into the mist of time. As he painted, Bob's mind drifted to his son Steve, who had inherited his father's artistic talent and his love of teaching. Bob wondered if Steve would understand the message he was trying to leave in this painting. Would he see that the mountains represented all the lessons Bob had tried to pass on? About art, about life, about finding peace in creation? The trees came next. And this is where Bob's message began to become clear to those who would later study the painting. Instead of his usual happy little trees full of life and vibrancy, Bob painted a single tree in the foreground. Leafless, its bare branches reaching toward the sky like arms stretched in surrender or acceptance. This lone tree was unlike anything Bob had ever painted before. Throughout his career, his trees had been symbols of life, growth, and resilience. They bent in the wind, but never broke. They grew in impossible places. They brought color and vitality to every landscape. But this tree was different. This tree was honest about endings. Bob spent nearly an hour on that single tree, adding details that would only be noticed by those who looked closely. The bark was textured with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for his most important teaching demonstrations. The branches were positioned with mathematical precision, each one reaching in a direction that seemed to point towards something beyond the canvas. At the base of the tree, Bob added something that would later make his friends weep when they discovered it. A small pile of fallen leaves, painted in colors that had once been vibrant, but were now faded to browns and golds. These leaves weren't just artistic elements. They were symbols of all the beautiful moments that had passed, all the lessons taught, all the lives touched. As Bob worked deeper into the night, adding layers of meaning to his farewell painting, he began to include elements that told the story of his life. A small cabin in the distance, barely visible through the mist, representing the humble beginnings that had shaped his character. A gentle stream that wound through the landscape, symbolizing the flow of creativity that had carried him through his career. But perhaps the most significant element was something Bob added to the lower right corner of the painting, so small that it would be missed by casual observers, but profound in its meaning for those who knew to look for it. It was a tiny signature that wasn't just his name, but included a small symbol he had never used before. A simple heart, followed by the words, "Until we meet again." Welcome to Bob Ross, The Untold Legacy. Thank you for joining us for this deeply moving story about Bob's final artistic statement. Before we continue with the incredible discovery of this painting's hidden meanings, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please share your location in the comments below. And if this story is already touching your heart, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps us honor Bob's memory by sharing these precious, untold moments from his life. Now, let's discover what happened when his friends first saw this extraordinary painting. The painting was completed in the early hours of March 16th. Just as the real sunrise began to paint the Florida sky outside Bob's studio window. He set down his brushes, cleaned them with the same methodical care he had shown throughout his career, and stepped back to look at what he had created. For several minutes, Bob stood in silence, studying the painting that had poured out of his heart. It was beautiful in a way that was different from his television work. More personal, more raw, more honest about the realities of human experience. It was Bob Ross without the gentle facade. Bob Ross speaking directly from his soul. Bob carefully placed the painting on his easel and left his studio. He would never pick up a paintbrush again. 3 weeks later, on July 4th, 1995, Bob Ross passed away at the age of 52. His death shocked the art world and devastated millions of fans who had found comfort in his gentle presence. But in the immediate aftermath of his passing, no one knew about the painting he had left behind in his private studio. It was Steve Ross, Bob's son, who discovered the painting 2 days after the funeral. He had come to his father's studio to begin the difficult process of sorting through Bob's personal effects, trying to preserve his father's legacy while dealing with his own grief. When Steve first saw the painting on the easel, he almost didn't recognize it as his father's work. The colors were more muted than usual, the subject matter more somber. But as he looked closer, he began to understand what his father had been trying to communicate in those final hours of painting. "I knew immediately that this wasn't just a painting," Steve would later tell close family friends. "This was Dad's way of saying goodbye when he couldn't find the words to say it out loud." Steve called Annette Kowalski, Bob's business partner and close friend, to come see the painting. When Annette arrived at the studio and saw what Bob had created, she broke down in tears. Bob always said that every painting was a conversation between the artist and the viewer, Annette later recalled. But this painting was different. This was Bob having a conversation with eternity, with everyone who loved him, with the part of himself that knew he was going home. As Steve and Annette studied the painting more closely, they began to discover layers of symbolism that revealed the depth of Bob's final artistic statement. The lone tree, they realized, wasn't just leafless. It was positioned at the exact center of the composition, making it the focal point of the entire piece. This was Bob himself, stripped of pretense, standing alone but unafraid in the face of what was to come. The sunset behind the tree wasn't the usual bright, hopeful sunset of Bob's television paintings. This sunset was painted with colors that suggested transition, transformation, the movement from one state of being to another. The way the light hit the tree's bare branches created shadows that seemed to dance across the landscape, as if life itself was moving through the painting. But it was the small details that broke their hearts. Hidden in the texture of the tree bark, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, Bob had painted a tiny bird in flight, so small it could have been dismissed as an accident of brushwork. But Steve recognized it immediately as the symbol Bob had always used to represent the human spirit. "Dad always said that our spirits were like birds," Steve explained to Annette through his tears. "Free to soar, meant to be wild and beautiful and unconfined by earthly limitations." That little bird was his way of showing us that he wasn't afraid of where he was going. The stream that wound through the painting held its own message. Unlike Bob's usual flowing water that moved from foreground to background, this stream seemed to flow from the earthly landscape toward the heavenly sky, as if it were a pathway between worlds. Along its banks, Bob had painted the tiniest flowers, so small they looked like dots of color unless you examined them closely. These flowers were painted in colors that represented every season: spring green, summer yellow, autumn red, winter white. They were Bob's way of showing that life in all its seasons had meaning and beauty, even as individual seasons came to an end. Dr. Patricia Wilson, an art therapist who had studied Bob's work extensively, was asked by the family to examine the painting. Her analysis revealed psychological and symbolic elements that suggested Bob had been processing his mortality for longer than anyone had realized. "This painting shows someone who has made peace with death," Dr. Wilson explained. "Every element suggests acceptance, completion, and a kind of spiritual readiness that indicates deep psychological work. Bob wasn't just painting his fears, he was painting his resolution." The most remarkable discovery came when Steve noticed something about the way his father had signed the painting. The tiny heart and words, "Until we meet again," weren't painted in Bob's usual brown signature color. They were painted in a color that only became visible when the light hit the painting at certain angles, a technique Bob had never used before. Investigation revealed that Bob had mixed a small amount of iridescent medium into his signature, making it shimmer subtly when viewed from different positions. It was as if Bob had wanted his final message to be discovered gradually, revealed only to those who took the time to really look at what he had created. That signature was like Dad himself, Steve reflected. Quiet, humble, but with hidden depths that revealed themselves to people who paid attention. The painting remained in Steve's private collection for several years, too emotionally significant to display publicly. But as word of its existence spread through the close-knit community of Bob Ross fans and colleagues, requests began coming in from people who wanted to see their beloved teacher's final artistic statement. In 2000, 5 years after Bob's death, Steve made the decision to share the painting with the world. It was first displayed at a small gallery in Orlando, Florida, with all proceeds going to lymphoma research. The response was overwhelming. Viewers who had watched the joy of painting for years found themselves seeing Bob in a completely new light. The man who had always seemed eternally optimistic and untroubled by life's difficulties had, it turned out, been capable of profound depth and honest confrontation with mortality. Seeing that painting changed how I understood Bob Ross, wrote art critic Maria Santos in her review. It revealed him not as the simple, cheerful painter of television, but as a complete human being capable of expressing the full range of human experience through his art. The painting began to travel to museums and galleries across the country, always accompanied by the story of its creation and discovery. Wherever it was displayed, viewers found themselves moved to tears by the quiet courage it represented. Many people reported that seeing the painting helped them process their own grief and mortality. Cancer patients, in particular, found comfort in knowing that Bob had faced his illness with the same grace and acceptance that characterized his entire approach to life. Dr. Michael Chen, an oncologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, began showing reproductions of the painting to terminal patients who were struggling with acceptance of their diagnoses. He found that Bob's example of facing death with artistic courage often helped patients find their own peace. Bob Ross showed us that dying doesn't have to be about fear and desperation, Dr. Chen explained. It can be about completion, about leaving something beautiful behind, about saying goodbye with dignity and grace. The painting also inspired other artists to create their own final works with similar intentionality. Art schools began teaching courses on legacy art, artwork created specifically to serve as final statements or farewells. Bob's painting became the primary example of how an artist could use their craft to process and communicate about mortality. But perhaps the most powerful response came from Bob's former PBS colleagues, who had worked with him for over a decade without ever knowing about his private struggles. When they saw the painting, many of them realized that Bob had been carrying the weight of his illness during the filming of his final television episodes. Looking back at those last shows, remembered camera operator Steve Martinez, I can see things I missed at the time. Bob was more reflective, more intentional about his words. He was saying goodbye to us, but we didn't know it. Producer Jane Morrison discovered that Bob had made small changes to his usual closing remarks during his final episodes, adding phrases like, "Remember the beauty in every day," and "Keep creating, keep sharing your gifts with the world." At the time, these had seemed like typical Bob Ross encouragement. In retrospect, they were revealed as carefully chosen farewell messages. The painting's influence extended beyond the art world into popular culture. It was featured in documentaries about Bob Ross, reproduced in books about art and mortality, and became a symbol of how creative people can face death with dignity and purpose. Writers and poets began referencing the lone tree painting as an example of how art can serve as a bridge between life and death, between what we can express in words and what can only be communicated through creative expression. Musician John Denver, who had been a friend of Bob's, wrote a song inspired by the painting called "The Tree That Stands Alone." The lyrics captured the quiet courage Bob had shown. "In the fading light of evening stands a tree without its leaves, telling stories without speaking of the beauty in release." 28 years after Bob's death, the painting continues to tour museums and galleries around the world. Each new generation of viewers discovers in it something relevant to their own experience of loss, transition, and the search for meaning in difficult times. Art historians now consider it one of the most significant pieces of American folk art from the late 20th century. Not because of its technical innovation, but because of its emotional honesty and symbolic power. It has been studied, analyzed, and written about in dozens of academic papers exploring the intersection of art, mortality, and spiritual expression. But for Steve Ross and the others who knew Bob personally, the painting remains first and foremost a final gift from someone they loved. A way for Bob to continue teaching even after his voice was silenced, showing by example how to face life's ultimate transition with grace, acceptance, and undiminished creativity. Every time I look at that painting, Steve says, I hear Dad's voice reminding me that endings can be beautiful too, that there's art to be found in every experience, even the ones we think we're not ready for. The small gallery where the painting was first displayed has created a memorial garden featuring a single tree, leafless in winter, full of life in spring, planted in Bob's honor. Visitors often leave small paintings and drawings at the base of the tree, continuing the conversation Bob started in his final work. Today, art therapy programs around the world use Bob's final painting as an example of how creativity can help people process difficult transitions. The Bob Ross method of using art to explore and accept mortality has helped thousands of patients, their families, and healthcare workers find peace in the face of loss. The painting's message, that death, like art, can be approached with beauty, intention, and love, continues to comfort people facing their own difficult journeys. In that small canvas, Bob Ross accomplished what he had always done best. He taught us something important about being human, and he did it with a gentle wisdom that had made him beloved by millions. If you've been moved by this story of how Bob Ross's final painting became a timeless meditation on mortality and love, please subscribe to Bob Ross, The Untold Legacy, to discover more incredible stories about the man who taught us that every ending can be beautiful when approached with an open heart and creative spirit.